So let me first begin by outlining what I plan to do. What I'd like to do today is first look at US FTAs, survey kind of what these agreements look like, what does it mean to talk about different types of linkages. So that's one issue we'll look at, and look at what are the various kinds of linkages that might be made in trade agreements. And then I'll talk about an analytical approach that one can use to try to understand issue linkages, how they're made, how they're created, how they are made both in the domestic political context as well as the international political context. So we'll look at that issue. And then there'll be some what I might call light empirical analysis, which looks at the US linkage process and then some comparisons to the EU. And so I'll conclude with that. So basically it tries to look at how linkages are made, what kinds of linkages are made in free trade agreements. So if we look at US FTAs, we can see there are a lot of US FTAs, particularly in recent times. And these FTAs, we had this original US-Israel FTA going back to 1985. That was the first US free trade agreement that was clearly driven a lot by security considerations back in 1985. Then you had the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement in 1989, which was then followed by this North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. But then we didn't really have much. So in some sense, we've only had 2 or 3 agreements before 2001. In part, that was because the United States was heavily committed to working through the GATT system and not following this European model, in some sense, of preferential trading agreements. And a number of countries, like Korea and some other countries, did not pursue any preferential trade agreements either. So this is a new development. And the United States, after 2001, particularly under the Bush administration, began to negotiate a number of free trade agreements. And so this has been written about by Richard Higgett, and he called this the securitization of free trade agreements. Unfortunately, that's a very, very confusing term, and I like Richard Higgett a lot, but I don't know that his grasp of economics is that good, because securitization means something very specific in economics, so that's unfortunately caused lots of confusion. On the other hand, the point that Richard Higgett was making is a very important one, so he was very insightful in that respect, and I think he just chose the wrong term, which created lots of confusion when you talk to economists. Securitization, are we selling off these FTAs? What are we doing? You know, that's in the global financial crisis, securitization means a very specific thing. So what Higgett argued was that the United States had begun to pursue a spate of free trade agreements that were essentially all connected to traditional security. And you only have to look at the list of these, some of these agreements. If you think about US Bahrain, US Morocco, and US Oman, you don't really have to be an expert in the global economy to realize that these are probably not the most important US trading partners in the world, and that there is clearly some security connection to Middle Eastern politics post 9/11 and tied to the Iraq War, etc. So Higgett was right in the sense that there has been some, I'll use this term, securitization or security linkages to trade, but I think he missed an important part. One part that he missed is that security agreements are hardly new. Securitization or use of security linkages is not new. They go back to the 1940s and even before, in the 19th century, etc. So the notion that somehow this was somehow invented whole cloth by the Bush administration is not correct. Right, so this notion of security agreements being somehow unique to the 2000s is not correct. Second, he missed the point that there's a lot of variation among these agreements. So if you look empirically, you can see that some agreements are indeed driven by traditional security concerns, but there are other agreements that are driven by environmental concerns or constrained by environmental concerns. Some are very much economic concerns and the like. So, and that's one of the things I'll be focusing on today. So when we look at these agreements, we have a plethora of agreements, but there's actually a considerable variation in terms of the types of agreements that we have. So if we think about what can you link to, if you think of the way economists tend to think about these issues, they often think about trade issues. Second, it's quite clear there are losses and gains to specific groups from FTAs. Second, there are other issues beyond trade, and there again economists have looked at some of these issues. They could be IP issues, they could be government procurement, there could be other issues that go beyond trade and investment to be included on the agenda. And some people say that one of the American incentives, for example, in the CUFTA agreement, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, was the inability of the U.S. to succeed in putting issues on the agenda that it was interested in the Uruguay round of negotiations. So what it did is it negotiated with the Canadians and introduced a lot of new issues, and those issues then found their way onto the Uruguay round agenda. So there's some interest in trying to expand beyond narrow economic issues to have other issues on the agenda. Other issues that are kind of economically based would be to catalyze broader negotiations. There again, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement makes some sense. That is, the U.S. negotiates this agreement with Canada, and in fact the U.S. explicitly said at this time that we can also play the regional game, that this was directed not at the Asians but at the Europeans, and that the Europeans were pursuing all these regional agreements, and we Americans too can pursue regional agreements, and we're going to make one with Canada. So that could be another way of catalyzing broader negotiations and kind of threatening other countries that we're going to go off on our own as well. And of course, a lot of agreements are to counter economic discrimination, and that I think is well understood in the political economy literature. So for example, if you have a US-Korea agreement, the Chorus Agreement, Japanese automakers are disadvantaged by that agreement because Korean car manufacturers have access to the American market tariff-free, especially over time. Now, beyond those economic issues, there are kind of traditional security issues. And here, a number of people have written on this, including Seung-Ju Lee and Mingyeo Ko and many others, and looking at such things as the war on terror. This is what something is that Higgett was talking about. The war on terror is an important aspect supporting allies. You can have balance of power considerations, somehow balancing. People often say that this current TPP versus RCEP that's taking place in the Asia Pacific right now is an example of balancing behavior, that the US is trying to create TPP as a counter to RCEP. I don't really believe that, but that's a separate issue. But that's a kind of balance of power consideration. And then I've thrown this in political support for economic reforms, probably because it didn't fit anywhere very well. But clearly that's an important element where the United States has tried to promote economic reform in particular countries, and sort of that's not really traditional security, but very broad traditional political security. Now, beyond traditional security issues, we also have these issues of the environment and various kinds of social issues. So you can have democracy promotion and the rule of law. You can have environmental issues that have made their way onto the American agenda and to the European agenda. You can have issues of human rights, and you can have issues of labor rights. And this is what I did. I tried to classify with the aid of some of my research assistants and look at all of these issues I mentioned and look at each one, go through each of these potential things, whether they're environment and social or traditional security, and then code whether those were factors for the agreement. So I won't bore you with all this, but basically if you look at Israel, you can see that rewarding allies, support for economic reform, some balance of power considerations, these were important. They were trying to catalyze negotiations. The EU had an agreement with Israel, so that was very important to the United States. So I essentially went through and I tried to code every one of these agreements and see what's driving this agreement. Right, what's driving this agreement, what's constraining this agreement. If you look at Peru, there are environmental and labor complaints. Colombia, environmental and labor constraints. Much less in Korea. Korea had much more to do with allies. It had a lot to do with broader negotiations and kind of classical drains from trade, because Korea was, of course, after Canada and Mexico, the largest partner with which the United States had a free trade agreement. So quite clearly, that's an important issue. So you may or may not believe this classification system, but I did try to objectively classify these in a way systematically as to what I thought were the more important issues that were involved in each of the FTAs. So that takes us to some theorizing. I would not say theory, but theorizing about thinking about linkages, right? So if we try to think about linkages, what drives linkages, how do they work? One issue is this a top-down or bottom-up process? So if you look at the domestic political process, is this something that's emanating from societal groups that are lobbying governments? Is this emanating from the fact that it's the US executive or some congressman or something who are trying to actually influence domestic groups? And so in other words, who's driving the linkage process? Right? And that's not always clear. It's very difficult to actually figure out who's driving the linkage process. Sometimes there may be quiet lobbying, and then it looks like the president's lobbying for something, but in fact the president had been lobbied. So I can't guarantee that I can figure out exactly who's actually behind the particular lobbying, but you can see that in general, Security considerations, pure traditional security, tend to be top-down, and other considerations tend to be bottom-up, but not always. I should point that out. In the case of Israel, there's a lot of bottom-up lobbying on Israel as well, so that's true. Second, we can think about this issue, which I've talked about for some time, and that Ernie Haas and a number of people talked about, called substantive versus tactical linkages. And so here the notion is, both in the domestic and in the international linkage process, are these linkages tactical in nature? Are they perceived by policymakers to simply be linkages based on power, which is, if you want to look at it bluntly, I'm more powerful than you, do what I want? That would be a tactical linkage. And a substantive linkage would be, let me try to convince you why you should protect your environment and why it's the benefit of everyone concerned. And third, of course, is this international bargaining and the strength of linkages. And that's an interesting question, because, of course, when you're bargaining and you're making linkages, even if you're more powerful, sometimes you may not be that much more powerful and you can't get everything you want. And one question that you might ask, and the EU has asked this question often, is, do you have to make concessions if you make a linkage, right? So if I say protect your trees, you say fine, I'll protect my trees, but you give me better access in textiles. Or I'll protect my trees, but you give me better access in something else. So what are the trade-offs that take place? And that's kind of bargaining strategy. And we've seen that historically as well, where countries who are facing a linkage may then demand something else in return. And that was the case, for example, in Korea, where Korea said, fine, we'll restrict our textiles, but give us more PL 488. And that's what they did in 1971 when there were trade negotiations taking place on textiles. So that's one thing. Now, on the substantive and tactical linkage, this is a complicated chart a little bit, but basically, what's the linker's view of the connection? So if I say, look, these two issues are connected, I believe they're connected. And then the question is, what's the target decision makers, right? So if I'm going to try to convince, Min-gyo-ku, who's the Korean trade negotiator, look, these things are connected, does Min-gyo-ku believe that they're connected? If he says, yeah, I see why we're negotiating those, knowledge is the basis, and you get a stable issue area. And an area where that makes some sense, it's easier to see this in some issues. So for example, if you're dealing with trade, and you're thinking about quotas and tariffs, today, no trade negotiator would say, look, tariffs and quotas are unconnected. I don't see why you keep wanting to deal with tariffs and quotas together. Every trade negotiator will say, yes, of course, basic economics tells you that you can use a quota or you can use a tariff, and either will work, right? You can block imports through tariff or a quota, right? So clearly those two are connected. So if you want to deal with restrictions at the border of imports, clearly you should deal with these together. That doesn't guarantee, just because knowledge is the basis, it doesn't guarantee the outcome, right? We can all agree, let's say, that there's global warming, but we may not agree who should cut back, right? So knowledge doesn't guarantee, it guarantees a stable issue area, it doesn't guarantee symmetry. These other two are more complicated. These other two suggest the following, a failed substantive. So I think these are connected issues. You don't believe they're connected, and I think that's probably the case for the Peruvian trade negotiators on, forest protection, that they don't really believe they're connected. They're going along with this problem because of power, so it's a temporary solution to this externality, if you want. And the Peruvians say, fine, we'll go along with what you want. And you say, yes, it's good for you. You say, yeah, fine, whatever. Right? Sure, that's what makes you feel good. You can pretend they're connected. I know you're more powerful than me. I'll do what you want. Right? So that's, I think, the case, unfortunately, of a lot of the trade negotiations where the U.S. says, whether they believe it or not, since they're more powerful, it's hard to tell what the counterpart really believes. Finally, you have this kind of, if you might say, somewhat bizarre idea, but just to make my 2x2 concept work, I'd have to put that in, which is, you have unconnected. So I don't think these issues are connected. I say, do what I want because I'm more powerful than you. And you actually say, I see why these are connected. You go, no, they're really not connected. I'm just trying to, make you do what I want. And you say, yeah, I see why they're connected. And so you have a misunderstanding. So you may get it'll become an unstable issue area with knowledge change. So your experts may tell you, yeah, I see the Americans are saying this, but yeah, they're really connected. And so it's kind of a misimpression. It's very hard to see those cases, but theoretically, at least that makes some sense that there might be some cases like that. Okay, the final thing is if you're trying to understand what goes on in international negotiations and we're looking at the strength of linkages, you can see there's a degree of domestic pressure. So if I am, don't forget this is like a, if you want a two-level game, so I'm being lobbied by a particular labor group or environmental group. So one issue is how much pressure am I facing, right? If I'm the US trade negotiator, am I really being forced or pressured by environmental groups or by labor groups to do something that affects how excited I am about linking things together? The power asymmetry in our relationship is very important, because if there's a lot of power asymmetry, that affects whether I'll succeed or not. And finally, how do I do this? Am I convincing them, or is it a pure power play? And what trade-offs do I see? Right? So in the European context, a number of European industry groups are upset, because what they say is the Europeans negotiators are obsessively trying to get the Indians and everybody else to agree to all these things, in exchange for which they want something else. And when you're negotiating with a pretty strong country, they may not go along with it without a concession. Right? And so now industrial groups saying we are being sacrificed at the altar of environment or labor groups, and that's going to hurt our international competitive position in a particular industry. So a lot of this obviously comes from the bottom. The most important one, which people are probably familiar with, is NAFTA negotiations, where labor and environmental provisions were included. President Clinton, when asked what he thought of NAFTA, he said, well, I'm for it and I'm against it, but if you elect me, I'll fix it, which was like a brilliant political strategy. He then negotiated these labor environmental agreements as side agreements. They actually didn't do very much, and there was actually a lot of lobbying, but he still managed to get the agreement through. But by that time, after 1994, labor and environmental groups became very activated, right? So there had been cases before, but this was really, I would say, the advent of trade policy involving labor and environment after 1994, and we've seen that continuing. We saw that most graphically in Seattle in 1999, and then in the Jordan Agreement, where NGOs were protesting the new round of trade negotiations, and then Clinton made some noises as well, saying yes, he kind of supported environmental groups, and then the meeting was it collapsed, and then they got started in Doha, which is why it became the Doha round, where it was hard to show up because you couldn't get a visa, so they got the agreement going there. Okay, so now let's look at some international negotiations of these groups that I've talked about before. So if we look at Singapore, Chile, Australia, and Korea, that kind of group that we talked about, we can see that the US kind of signaled it signed with Singapore first, but not with Chile. Why? Because the Chileans were not being supportive on the Iraq War, and the Singaporeans were. So as a kind of punishment of the Chileans, the US signed with Singapore first, although it then went ahead and signed with Chile. The US also pursued an accord with Australia, refused to negotiate with New Zealand, again because of the Iraq War. This is in the Bush administration. And if we look at the Chorus Agreement, there was a lot of top-down pressure. There were a lot of security linkages to security, there were substantive linkages to security, but there was also opposition by auto producers and beef, and Mingyu Ku and Sung Ju have both written about Chorus a lot, so I won't talk about that. We can talk about that during question period, maybe, in terms of what were the driving factors in terms of linkages there. If we look at these other agreements, which are highly security-driven agreements, Israel, Morocco, Bahrain, and Oman, you can see, and especially if you look at the data, you can see, I mean, there was estimates by the Congressional Research Service, CRS does estimates, how many job gains will there be if there's an agreement with Oman, and sometimes it's like 12 people would get jobs in the US, So Morocco was like 200 people. It was just so absurdly low that you could not in any stretch of the imagination believe these are driven by economic terms. So these are the ones that Higgett tended to focus on, which are, of course, important. Now, if you look at other agreements like CAFTA, Peru, Colombia, and Panama, you see that CAFTA was being used to try to create this FTAA, Free Trade Area of the Americas, which the US is ultimately unsuccessful in doing. Here in Colombia and Panama, there were issues of security and financial considerations, and the Panamanian rules on kind of tax evasion and stuff. And with respect to Colombia, there was a lot of issues of security. There were also union issues with respect to Colombia, protection of union leaders, so that also became an issue in the negotiations. So these negotiations have shown up, and in US negotiations, you do see this. Now, what's very interesting about US negotiations is there's no explicit security linkage. Right? I cannot recall reading any FTA in which it says you will do X about X weapons, or you will, do X about providing us with a base or anything like that. So U.S. agreements are often security driven, but the text of the agreement does not say much about security. Okay? And I find that particularly interesting because when you go to the European agreements, we can see the Europeans are quite the opposite. The Europeans are obsessed with putting, maybe they're more loyally than the Americans, they're obsessed with putting everything in writing. You must, follow the Copenhagen criteria. You must have these other things. And if you look at some of the research on this, you can see that the EU essentially has 4 categories of countries with it negotiates FTAs. The so-called close neighbor countries, and these close neighbor countries are often in the pre-accession category. Right? So these are countries that would like to join the EU or that are trying to join the EU at some point down the line or have some association agreement. And there the EU actively, explicitly makes security linkages. Right? And we'll talk about those in a little bit what they are, but they're often with respect to small arms or respect to nuclear weapons and the like. Here in the near bordering countries, this could be North African countries, again, there is a clear, but not a vital security link, but the clear effort to link security in a lot of these cases. And of course also these other kinds of agreements, labor and environment. If the former colonies, these developing countries, the so-called Cotonou Agreement, which became ACP, you have democracy and human rights, you have political provisions, you've actually had a suspension of the agreement, so the EU actively uses these agreements as a way of influencing policy. And the last one is this new EU initiative, which we'll talk about, where the EU has tried to negotiate with countries like Korea, which it did successfully, and where the EU has tried to negotiate with countries like India, where, as far as I know, as of a few days ago, it was not successful in doing that. And here there's a real test, and we'll look at why that's the case. So what are these things that the EU does? It links all of these political clauses: human rights, democracy promotion. It has provisions on weapons of mass destruction. These are all called essential to any agreement, right? So essential and non-essential means, do they have to be in the text? These 3 have to be in the text of every agreement. Okay? Now, what's the problem? You go to some small African country and you say, get rid of your weapons of mass destruction. They'll do it because they don't have any. Okay? You go to the Indians and say, we've decided you should no longer be a nuclear power, and the Indians, tell the EU to go to hell. I mean, or whatever, prefer your favorite term, tell them to, disappear, right? So basically, they don't care. So this idea that some people say, oh, Europeans have been very successful in using linkages to alter countries' behavior is what we might call selection bias, right? Because the agreements that they've negotiated have been with small and weak countries, by and large. When they negotiate with big countries who care, right? With Korea, Koreans had okay labor standards as far as they were concerned. Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons, South Korea, so they sign it because they don't care. But with countries where there's actually some issue, the EU has not been successful. So if you look at some of the work in this area, it says, oh, EU's been successful. Well, how do you define success? There's a selection bias problem, as I said here, and small arms, etc. So that's an important issue. So what happened? Basically, this new policy of global Europe is the policy that the EU implemented in 2006. And what they decided to do was they decided they would start negotiating with bigger countries. They would stop their moratorium on not negotiating FTAs for a while. And they would then start looking at countries that were economically important, right? So like that meant India, that meant Korea, that meant potentially Singapore and some ASEAN countries. And so this should be taken into account. So what they were saying is the Global Europe Strategy, which was developed by the Commission, by the way, was that they should try to worry about trade. Surprising, but they should try to meet economic goals and not just try to influence everybody's policy. That was what the EU conclusion was. But then there was this debate that took place among the EU and also with the Parliament that essential elements must be included. So some people in the EU worry a lot about, Anders Anlund worries about it, that you can't really make progress if you're throwing everything into the agreement. It's just too many linkages taking place, particularly with big countries. So what are the EU doing? They've been negotiating with ASEAN countries in India. That's still going on. They signed the accord in 2011. In India, there's a lot of controversy on political clauses, and the Indians do not agree to that, and the EU is worried that they will not make progress. So that's very important. So how they'll eventually resolve that, I'm not sure right now, but that's what's going on. So let me just conclude now and do a little bit of a comparison. This is the paper I'm still writing. It's in progress, so I can't say I've done it. But basically what we've seen is that both the EU and US have used traditional security linkages in their trade agreements. It's quite clear they've done that. And from looking at the evidence, it would seem, in the little mini case studies I've done, that they've really agreed not because of substantive reasons, but for tactical reasons. And that may not come as a big surprise, but basically, other countries are going along because of power. What's very interesting is this comparison right here. EU is very explicit in its use of political linkages, and therefore runs into problems with powerful countries. The US, security clearly is a driving factor in a lot of the agreements, say Korea or Israel or Jordan or a number of these countries, but they don't explicitly put this in the agreement, right? So that's kind of an interesting contradiction or twist. One is very obsessed with it, but puts everything in the agreement. The other, actually, security is probably really important. For EU, it's probably not even that important in some cases. But here, security is really important for the US, but it doesn't put this explicitly, but it's leading to driving them. And the US is much more explicit, ironically, on environment and labor, and much more aggressive than the EU. So in my view, this is kind of a little counterintuitive, where we say the Europeans, you know, this kind of Kagan view, Europeans are from Venus, Americans are from Mars, and Europeans care so much about environment and labor. And ironically, in the agreements, the Americans seem to be totally obsessed with environment and labor because of all this lobbying that's taking place. EU seems to be obsessed with all these political clauses, and they're going to change the world to make it safer with small arms and get rid of weapons of mass destruction. And yet, the reality is when the EU tries to negotiate with big countries, it's not failing. So the real test of trying to understand, do linkages work, which is a big issue, a big debate in the literature, is, well, let's see them do it with a big country, right? With a little country, you can bash them around and they'll do what you want, but let's see if it really works with a big country. So this is kind of where we've come to at this point. As I said, we're still trying to really understand what is it that differentiates the American approach from the EU approach. This is some of the findings we've had, and Anders Anlund has worked on the European part a little more, try to understand that, and that's where we're trying to go to really understand this comparison.